Hi, Bill here. I'd like to talk about the classical centre formation. So the classical centre is when white has pawns on d4 and e4, and it could also be when black has pawns on d5 and e5. So either player could have the classical centre. So the two pawns in the centre control all these squares, and they occupy some space in the centre. So it's generally a plus to have pawns in the centre. So a formation means the different ways we can set up our position sort of to some extent independently of what black does. Okay, now we'll have a look at some of the ways may arise. So in this position, white starts with a hypermodern opening. He gets ready to fancho the bishop. Black seizes the centre. He gets a pawn on one of the four central squares. White completes the fancho, and black moves the pawn into the centre. So black has a classical centre. He's got pawns on the e5 square and the d5 square. So these pawns control a lot of space. Now often what happens with the classical centre is if both knights come out to their natural squares, both knights guard the centre pawns. The drawback of the knight blocking these pawns is it restricts these pawns, which won't be able to move until the knights move. However, once we've got these two pawns in the centre, it's generally pretty easy to bring out the remaining pieces. The bishop's got a choice of many squares to move to. The queen can get off the back line, and the king can castle. And in the absence of an open file, it's good to put the rooks on the files most likely to become opened, which is where your advanced pawns are. So here's the same setup, but we've added some more moves. We've developed the bishops, moved the queen off the back line, the king has castled, the rooks have moved to the central files. So this might be a fairly typical sort of classical pawn setup. At the right moment, these pawns may advance. Sometimes, in addition to having a classical centre, white can play c3. So this helps to defend the pawn on d4, but has the drawback of taking the best square from the queen's knight. Another type of centre is white moving the pawn to f3, giving the e4 more strength, but taking the best square from the king's knight. So this is a bit like a same-ish. So I've called it the half same-ish formation. In a same-ish formation, this pawn would also be on c4. The same-ish is a line against the king's Indian. So these are variations of the classical centre. Another setup is with the pawn on f3, white can castle queenside. The pawn here stops any knight here harassing the queen bishop. And if black's king's castled, this pawn here may defend g4. So we notice that the pawn is taking the best square from the knight, so the knight's had to go to e2. So we'll have a look at a few ways white can expand from this position. So if the black king is on the king's side, we can advance the knight's pawn, we can advance the rook's pawn, we can keep advancing the rook's pawn, and if the king's, we may attack with bishop h6. Sometimes white moves all three pawns to the fourth rank. So this is the Austrian formation. There's a line against one opening called the Austrian attack. So this gives white even more space in the centre, but the drawback of this is it may block a queen bishop on this diagonal, whereas these two pawns generally don't block the bishops. The best squares for the knights with the Austrian formation are on their natural squares, where they control 8 squares. The knight tends to be weaker when it's on the second rank or on the edge. So this is a typical formation. Often with a pawn on f4, it's good to castle kingside and put the rook behind the pawn. Got the bishop on a square where it defends the e-pawn, and if this pawn advances, it's a very good chance it will, because this quite a few things guarding the e5 square. This diagonal will be opened. This bishop's a little bit restricted by this. One advantage for white is having this pawn missing makes it easy to bring the queen out to the king side. Okay, so sometimes the Austrian formation is combined with c3. And often in the queen pawn games we get this kind of setup where, like the Austrian formation, white's got 3 pawns on the 4th rank, but this pawn blocks the bishop. The king bishop may restrict the king bishop. So this is a mirror image of the Austrian formation. So it's going to be difficult for black to play d5, but he might hit with c5 or e5. Okay, so this is a typical white formation against the so-called King's Indian. So both knights are on their natural squares. And a logical continuation with your white the castle king side. This bishop helps control d4. This bishop helps defend the knight. The knight's on its natural square. And the queen is off the back line, so the rooks are connected. And the queen doesn't get in the way of any other pieces. This is a variation of the classical setup where white has fan shadowed his king bishop instead. And this is a full sameish formation which white can play against the King's Indian setup, where white has 3 pawns on the 4th, supported by a pawn on f3. So the queen knight is on its natural square. So we've got the bishop defending d4. These are lined up, so if black's got a bishop on g7, we can move the bishop down and attack it. Now we've got the 4-pawn attack, which is an opening against the King's Indian. So white has got 4 pawns on the 4th rank. So it allows both knights to move to the natural squares. Some slight drawbacks are we've lost a bit of time making extra pawn moves. Also, the pawns can get in the way of the bishop. Nonetheless, white can sometimes get a good roller going with e5 or d5 later on. White controls a lot of space. So here's a typical situation where the 4 pawns attack. The 2 knights behind the pawns. White's castle king side, supporting a pawn on f4. Bishop's on e2. And at some stage, white will be able to push e5. Okay, so now we've got a formation where white has a classical pawn centre and pawns, both bishop pawns on the 3rd rank. So these do deny the knights of their best square. So that's the end of the section. So that was a look at some of the ways white can develop once he's got the pawns on the 2 centre squares. And of course, black can do all the same, potentially do all the same setups. Thank you for watching.